Welcome to Egopedia. Today, we dive into a powerful truth. Your ego can be your greatest ally or your silent enemy. In this episode, explore the art of recognizing the ego before it takes the wheel and steers your life off course. Stay with us as we uncover the hidden patterns that shape your identity, reactions, and decisions. Let's begin the journey of self-awareness together.
The art of recognizing the ego before it controls your life. The ego is often misunderstood, misrepresented, and underestimated in its influence over human behavior and decision-making. While the ego plays a vital role in shaping identity and self-concept, unchecked ego can distort perception, damage relationships, and limit personal growth. This article explores the mechanisms of ego formation, identifies common signs of ego-driven behavior, and provides actionable strategies to recognize and regulate the ego before it dictates one's life. Drawing from psychology, mindfulness, and emotional intelligence frameworks, this paper emphasizes the importance of ego awareness as a core life skill in modern society. Introduction. In a world driven by image, competition, and social validation, the ego often becomes a silent dictator, shaping how we react, decide, and relate to others. The ego, defined in psychological terms as the part of the psyche that mediates between the conscious mind, the unconscious, and reality, is not inherently negative. However, when unexamined, it becomes a filter that distorts truth, inflates self-importance, and drives behavior rooted in fear and insecurity. This article aims to present the ego not as an enemy, but as a psychological construct that must be understood and managed. The key is not to destroy the ego, but to recognize it early, honestly, and consistently. 1. What is the ego? A psychological lens. To understand how to recognize the ego before it controls your life, we must first define what the ego truly is, beyond the buzzwords, beyond the popular misinterpretations. In classical psychology, the ego was first introduced by Sigmund Freud as one of the three components of the human psyche: the ID, the ego, and the superego. The ID operates on instinct and desire. It seeks pleasure and avoids pain, regardless of consequences. The superego represents our internalized ideals, morality, and societal norms. The ego is the mediator between the two, managing the impulsive desires of the ID and the restrictive rules of the superego while navigating the demands of reality. In this framework, the ego plays a necessary and healthy role. It helps us delay gratification, make rational decisions, and function socially. Without it, we'd be impulsive or guilt-ridden creatures pulled constantly in two extreme directions. However, as the field of psychology evolved, and with the rise of Eastern philosophies influencing modern wellness practices, the definition of ego took on a more nuanced, often spiritual dimension. In contemporary psychology and self-development, the ego is often described not just as a mediator, but as the constructed self, the version of ourselves that we believe we are. This version is built over time through experiences, labels, and the roles we play in life. Think of the ego as the story you tell yourself about who you are, the image you want others to believe, the mask you wear to feel safe, superior, or in control. This ego self is not inherently bad. It helps you build confidence, assert boundaries, and maintain your sense of identity. But problems arise when you over-identify with this constructed self, when your entire worth becomes attached to a job title, a reputation, an opinion, or a past experience. Let's illustrate with an example. Imagine a person who thinks, "I am a successful manager." That statement alone is not ego. It becomes egoic when the person needs that identity to feel worthy. If they lose the job, their sense of self collapses. The ego can't handle change, failure, or contradiction. It clings to fixed definitions. Another way to view the ego is through the lens of protection and projection. The ego is constantly trying to protect us from feeling small, from being rejected, from facing uncomfortable truths. To do that, it creates defenses like pride, arrogance, denial, or perfectionism. For example, someone who constantly interrupts in conversation may not just be rude. Their ego might be protecting them from the fear of being unheard or unseen. Someone who insists they're always right may not be arrogant, They may be terrified of being perceived as ignorant or weak. The ego whispers, "You are not safe unless you are in control." And when we believe that voice without question, we begin to act from a place of fear, rather than freedom. Neuroscience also supports this perspective. The brain is wired for self-preservation, and the ego often aligns with the brain's default mode network, responsible for self-referential thinking. This is the voice in your head that constantly says, "How does this affect me?" Or "What will people think?" It's natural, but not always helpful. To summarize, the ego can be understood in three overlapping layers. 1. The rational mediator, a healthy, functional part of the psyche. 2. The identity builder, a psychological mask formed from beliefs, stories, and social roles. 3. The protector, a reactive force that defends against emotional discomfort and uncertainty. In its healthiest form, the ego helps you navigate the world. In its unconscious form, the ego becomes your world and blinds you to what lies beyond it. Understanding this foundational role of the ego allows us to move into deeper inquiry. How do we catch it before it hijacks our thoughts, relationships, and choices? 2. Early warning signs. When the ego takes the driver's seat. Recognizing when the ego has taken control is not always obvious, especially because it often disguises itself as confidence, assertiveness, or even self-care. The ego doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't force, it persuades. And it usually wears a mask that feels familiar, even comfortable. But if left unchecked, the ego slowly becomes the unseen force steering your decisions, shaping your identity, and distorting your relationships. Before long, you're not living with your ego, you're living as your ego. To regain control, you must learn to spot the early warning signs that the ego has slipped into the driver's seat. These signs usually appear in our reactions, thoughts, and daily interactions. Below are key indicators, broken down with psychological insight and real-life examples. 1. Overreaction to criticism. The ego hates being wrong, especially in public. When your sense of identity is rooted in being competent, respected, or admired, even gentle feedback can feel like an attack. Warning signs. Feeling defensive immediately after receiving feedback. Justifying your actions aggressively. Discrediting the person giving the critique. Example. Your coworker suggests a better way to organize your report. Instead of seeing it as helpful input, your immediate reaction is to feel insulted, thinking, "Who does he think he is?" Ego translation. If I'm wrong, I'm less worthy. 2. The need to always be right. The ego seeks certainty because it equates being wrong with being weak. When the ego dominates, debates turn into battles. The goal is no longer truth, it's winning. Warning signs. Interrupting others frequently. Taking disagreements personally. Struggling to admit when you're wrong, even in small matters. Example. You argue over a trivial detail like the date of a movie release, and instead of checking or laughing it off, you double down, even when you suspect you're incorrect. Ego translation. My identity is tied to my correctness. 3. Defensiveness and blame shifting. A fragile ego sees mistakes as threats to self-worth. Instead of owning them, it shifts the blame to protect the image of perfection. Warning signs. Making excuses instead of taking responsibility. Criticizing others to deflect attention from your flaws. Avoiding accountability at all costs. Example. You forget an appointment and immediately say, "Well, no one reminded me," instead of simply owning the oversight. Ego translation. Mistakes mean I'm not good enough, so I must redirect blame. 4. Obsession with status, image, or titles. The ego feeds on external validation. It often confuses being seen with being valuable. When this happens, your worth becomes tied to what you have, not who you are. Warning signs. A constant comparison to others' achievements. A needing to prove yourself through possessions or job titles. A feeling superior or inferior based on material or social status. Example. You feel secretly threatened when a friend buys a new car or gets promoted, even if you're happy for them on the surface. Ego translation. If I'm not ahead, I'm falling behind. 5. Fear of vulnerability. The ego sees vulnerability as a weakness. It avoids emotional exposure, believing that to stay powerful, one must stay guarded. Warning signs. Avoiding honest conversations about emotions. Downplaying your struggles. Refusing to ask for help, even when needed. Example. You're feeling overwhelmed, but when someone asks how you're doing, you quickly respond, "I'm fine, just busy." Ego translation. If I show weakness, I'll lose respect or control. 6. Inability to forgive. The ego holds onto grudges not because it enjoys pain, but because it enjoys control. Forgiveness feels like surrender. Holding resentment feels like power. Warning signs. Replaying past hurts in your mind. Wishing harm or failure on those who wronged you. Justifying your anger as righteous or deserved. Example. Even years later, you still talk about how a friend betrayed you, using it as a reason not to trust anyone. Ego translation. Letting go means they win, and I lose. 7. Rigid self-narratives. When you say, "That's just who I am," it's often your ego trying to avoid growth. The ego wants consistency and control. It resists change, even when that change is good for you. Warning signs. Resisting new perspectives or personal development. Using labels to justify poor behavior, e.g., "I'm just blunt," equals excuse for being rude. Believing your identity is fixed and unchangeable. Example. You're told that a softer approach might improve your leadership, but you dismiss it with, "I'm not a soft person. I don't do emotional stuff." Ego translation. Change threatens the version of me I've built. Why these signs matter. These signs aren't just personality quirks. They are emotional indicators, flashing lights on the dashboard of your inner life. Each one signals that your ego is in control and steering you based on fear, pride, or insecurity rather than truth, wisdom, or compassion. And here's the most important insight. Ego-driven reactions are not evidence of failure. They're invitations to pause, reflect, and grow. When you spot these behaviors in yourself, don't judge. Just notice. Each time you recognize your ego in action, you reclaim a little more freedom from its grip. 3. Why the ego must be recognized, not rejected. When people begin to explore the concept of the ego, a common reaction is to want to eliminate it altogether. The ego is the problem, we often hear. So, I need to get rid of it. But this is a misunderstanding, and ironically, it's often the ego itself that wants to be seen as the one who has no ego. The goal is not to reject or destroy the ego. The goal is to recognize it, understand it, and integrate it into a healthier, more conscious self. The ego is not the enemy, it's a survival tool. The ego formed for a reason. As we grow, especially in early childhood, we begin to shape a sense of self by absorbing messages from our environment. What behaviors get us love? What actions bring punishment? What traits earn praise or attention? In response, the ego develops to protect us. It constructs a persona, a mask, to help us survive emotionally and socially. For example, a child who only gets love when they succeed may develop a high-achiever ego. A teen bullied for being sensitive may create a tough persona to hide their emotions. An adult who grew up feeling invisible may become the loudest voice in the room. These adaptations aren't bad, they're intelligent. They helped you navigate life. But over time, what once protected you can become what limits you. The ego resists change not out of malice, but out of fear. It believes, if I let go of this identity, I won't be safe. Why rejection doesn't work. Trying to reject or kill the ego doesn't work because 1. The ego is part of the mind. You can't fight your own psychology without causing inner conflict. 2. Rejection creates suppression, which makes the ego go underground and become harder to see. 3. Rejection is itself an egoic reaction, driven by the desire to be pure, enlightened, or above it all. In spiritual circles, this often becomes what's called spiritual bypassing. That's when people use spiritual language or practices to avoid facing their real emotional wounds. They claim to have transcended the ego, but in reality, they've just wrapped it in a new identity, an identity that says, I'm more awakened than you. The irony? That too is the ego, just wearing a robe and sitting in meditation. Recognition is the key to integration. Recognition is different from rejection. It means you become aware of the ego's patterns without being controlled by them. Recognition says, I see that I'm getting defensive. That's my ego feeling threatened. I notice I want to prove myself in this conversation. Let me pause. I feel the urge to post this online, just to get praise. Interesting. In these moments, you're not fighting the ego, you're watching it. You're creating distance between who you really are and the identity the ego wants to protect. This is called conscious awareness. And it's in this space that you begin to act from freedom, not fear. The power of integration. When you integrate the ego instead of rejecting it, you give it a new role, servant, not master. Let's be clear, the ego has value. It helps you set boundaries, stand up for yourself, define your goals, express confidence in your abilities, take pride in your work. But integrated ego works in balance with other inner parts, like empathy, humility, and intuition. It stops running the show and starts contributing in a healthier, more constructive way. Unconscious ego says, I am what I do, what I have, what others think of me. Conscious ego says, I know who I am, but I'm open to growth, feedback, and change. From reaction to response. One of the most powerful results of recognizing the ego is that it allows you to move from reaction to response. Reaction is fast, emotional, and ego-driven. Response is thoughtful, grounded, and soul-driven. For example, a reactive ego says, I have to win this argument to feel respected. A conscious response says, this disagreement doesn't threaten my worth. Let me listen more carefully. This subtle shift can change your relationships, your leadership style, and your entire approach to life. Compassion for the ego. It's tempting to see the ego as the villain. But in truth, the ego is a younger version of you, still trying to keep you safe, still afraid of being hurt or forgotten. The practice, then, is not to destroy the ego but to parent it. To say gently, thank you for trying to protect me, but I don't need you to take over anymore. I've got this now, with clarity, not fear. This is how we grow, not by rejecting who we were, but by recognizing who we no longer need to be. 4. Practical strategies to recognize and regulate the ego. Understanding the ego intellectually is one thing, but transforming your relationship with it requires practice. Just like training a muscle, regulating the ego takes awareness, discipline, and consistency. The good news? You don't have to fight the ego. You only need to notice it, gently, consistently, without judgment. The more often you catch it in action, the less control it has over you. Below are practical, everyday strategies that help you recognize and regulate the ego so that you respond to life with clarity, not reactivity. 1. Practice the pause. Create space between trigger and reaction. When the ego feels threatened, it responds fast, often without thinking. It might interrupt, defend, argue, or shut down. One of the most powerful ego regulation tools is the pause. When someone criticizes you, when you're tempted to prove a point, when you feel the urge to control or dominate a situation.
Pause. Breathe.
Wait 3 seconds. This short pause interrupts the ego's automatic script and opens the door for a more conscious response.
Practice.
Before replying in conflict, silently ask, is this my ego reacting or my truth responding? 2. Observe without judgment. Watch the ego like a scientist. The ego loses power the moment you become an observer instead of a participant. Imagine watching your thoughts and behaviors like a curious scientist or compassionate friend. Instead of saying, I can't believe I reacted like that. I'm such a mess. Say instead, there's my ego trying to protect me again. Interesting. Self-judgment only strengthens the ego. Observation dissolves it. Practice. At the end of each day, reflect on 1 to 2 ego-driven moments.
Ask.
What triggered it? What was I afraid of? What can I learn from it? 3. Identify your ego triggers. Every ego has its sensitive spots, areas where we feel especially vulnerable or insecure. These are often shaped by childhood, trauma, or social conditioning. Common ego triggers include being ignored or dismissed, being corrected or challenged, seeing someone else succeed, not being in control, feeling misunderstood. Knowing your triggers gives you a head start in managing your reactions. Practice. Make a personal ego trigger list. Next to each one, write down the emotion it stirs and the story your ego tells you. Example. Trigger. Being interrupted. Emotion. Frustration. Ego story. They don't respect me. I'm not being heard. Recognizing this makes it easier to pause and reframe. 4. Practice humble inquiry. Replace ego with curiosity. The ego wants to prove. Consciousness wants to understand. When you feel the urge to correct, criticize, or control, try asking a question instead. Instead of, "That's not how it works."
Try.
"Interesting, can you walk me through how you see it?" Instead of, "You're wrong."
Try.
"What makes you think that?" "I'd love to hear more." Genuine curiosity dissolves the ego's grip. It opens the door to empathy and connection. 5. Use the mirror test. Ask, "What does this say about me?" When you're annoyed or offended by someone else, it's often your ego that feels exposed or inferior. What we judge in others often reflects something we deny or dislike in ourselves. Practice. When you feel triggered by another person, ask, "What part of me feels threatened right now? Is this about them? Or is this really about me?" This inner reflection turns discomfort into personal growth. 6. Embrace vulnerability. Share before the ego speaks for you. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's a sign of strength and awareness. When you speak openly about your feelings, before the ego twists them into blame or defense, you take back control. Practice. When you feel tension rising, try saying, "This is hard for me to say, but I feel insecure right now. I notice I'm getting defensive. Can we slow down? I'm not sure why this is bothering me, but I want to understand." Speaking from vulnerability invites connection. Speaking from ego creates distance. 7. Meditate and reflect daily. Meditation helps calm the mind and trains you to observe your thoughts without attachment. Even 5 to 10 minutes a day can increase your awareness of ego-driven thinking. You don't need to stop your thoughts. Just notice them, label them, and return to stillness. Practice. Sit in silence. Focus on your breath. When thoughts arise, gently label them. That's a proving thought. That's a comparison thought. That's a fear-based thought. This teaches your mind that you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness behind them. 8. Welcome discomfort as a teacher. The ego thrives on comfort and predictability. Growth requires stepping outside both. Practice. The next time you feel awkward, uncertain, or exposed, don't resist it.
Ask.
What is this moment trying to teach me? Discomfort is often the doorway to transformation. What feels like a threat to the ego is often a gift to the soul. Final thought. Make it a daily practice. Ego regulation isn't a one-time achievement. It's a daily discipline, like brushing your teeth or stretching your body. You might not see instant results, but over time, the changes are profound. You become less reactive, more grounded. You stop needing approval to feel valuable. You speak with humility, listen with presence, and lead with integrity. In short, you live more from your authentic self, not your protective ego. 5. Ego in the age of social media. The ego has always been a part of the human experience. But in the age of social media, it has found a megaphone, one that broadcasts, amplifies, and reinforces our sense of self-importance, identity, and comparison 24 hours a day. Social media doesn't create the ego, but it magnifies its needs. The need to be seen, the need to be validated, the need to be admired, envied, or liked. In many ways, we are no longer just living our lives. We are curating them, branding them, and presenting them through digital filters. And the ego loves it. But what begins as self-expression often turns into self-performance. Let's explore how the ego shows up in the digital world and what we can do about it. 1. The ego's new playground. Validation through metrics. Likes, shares, comments, followers, views. These are the currency of digital attention. The ego sees these numbers as direct reflections of worth. Examples. You post a photo that gets hundreds of likes. You feel important, attractive, validated. You post a thought or project that gets little response. You feel invisible, rejected, even if it had real value. This cycle creates a dopamine loop. The ego becomes addicted to external approval and begins to crave digital affirmation over internal peace. Key question. Do I feel less valuable when I receive less attention online? 2. The comparison trap. Social media is a highlight reel, not real life. But the ego forgets that. It compares your full, messy, behind-the-scenes life to someone else's filtered front stage. They seem happier. They look more successful. They appear more attractive, productive, or fulfilled. And suddenly, your ego starts whispering. You're falling behind. You're not enough. You need to do more, be more, show more. This comparison isn't based on truth, it's based on illusion. Yet the emotional impact is very real. Envy, anxiety, low self-worth. Practice. When scrolling, ask yourself, am I being inspired or being triggered? Am I consuming with awareness or comparing unconsciously? 3. Image crafting. The rise of the digital persona. The ego on social media doesn't just react, it also creates. It builds a persona, carefully designed to attract approval and admiration. You might notice, only posting flattering photos or achievements, avoiding vulnerability or authenticity, feeling pressure to perform, even in moments of rest or celebration. The danger? You begin to live for the audience, not for yourself. You become disconnected from your real emotions, needs, and identity. Quote to remember. Be careful not to lose yourself while trying to impress a world that doesn't even know you. 4. Outrage and opinions. Ego through argument. Social media platforms reward emotional intensity. Posts that are angry, divisive, or dramatic often gain more engagement. For the ego, this creates a new opportunity to be right, to dominate, to feel morally superior. Online, many arguments are not about understanding, they're about winning. The ego thrives in this space because it equates being louder with being right. Practice. Before commenting or reacting online, pause and ask, am I sharing to connect or to control? Would I say this face-to-face with care? 5. The performance of vulnerability. Ironically, even vulnerability can become a tool of the ego. In the age of likes and shares, emotional openness is sometimes performed for attention. It becomes part of a brand, not a process of healing. You may notice oversharing for validation, measuring the success of your vulnerability by engagement, feeling pressure to stay relatable or authentic for others. This creates a strange distortion. You appear vulnerable on the outside, while your inner self remains hidden and guarded. Reminder: true vulnerability is not about performing your wounds, it's about being seen in them, with or without applause. How to stay ego-aware online. While social media isn't inherently bad, it becomes dangerous when it feeds the unconscious ego. The key is intentional, mindful use. Here are some strategies. Audit your intentions. Before posting or reacting, ask, why am I sharing this? Do I need to be seen, or do I have something valuable to say? Would I still share this if no one liked it? Take digital detoxes. Periodically disconnect from platforms. Use that time to reconnect with your unfiltered thoughts, your physical reality, relationships that don't require Wi-Fi. Follow with intention. Unfollow or mute accounts that trigger comparison, envy, or self-doubt. Follow those who uplift, educate, or remind you of your deeper self, not your ego self. Share from wholeness, not emptiness. Let your posts be a reflection of presence, not performance. Share because it's real, not because it will be received. Reclaiming the self beyond the screen. The digital world is not the enemy, but it is a mirror. It reflects what the ego wants, fears, and clings to. By becoming aware of how your ego behaves online, you reclaim your agency. You begin to use technology without being used by it. You post from purpose, not from pride. You scroll with presence, not comparison. And most importantly, you remember, your true worth is not measured in likes, followers, or viral moments. It's measured in how deeply you know yourself, even when no one's watching. The art of inner authority. Recognizing the ego is not a one-time event. It is a lifelong discipline. It requires courage to look inward and honesty to admit that some of our strengths are really ego-driven coping strategies. The more we recognize the ego's voice, the more we begin to hear a deeper voice within us, a voice of calm, clarity, and conscious choice. This is the art of inner authority, when you no longer react to protect an image, but respond to express your truth. In mastering this art, we do not destroy the ego. We integrate it. We take the will back from the ego's hands and learn to drive our lives with awareness, not illusion.